over for this evening's seminar. The next one will be in 2 weeks' time. Isabel Hamley is coming to talk to us, titled to be confirmed, but it will be about the Bible and mental health. I think that's probably fair to say. Isabel is the Archbishop of Canterbury's chaplain in Lambeth and is a biblical scholar. Indeed, she has a PhD from this university, so she knows Durham very well. And she has pastoral and theological interests in the field of mental health, which she'll be talking to us about. She's also co-editing a book on the mental health and the Bible, which we hope will be out in a year or so. So do come. She's an engaging speaker. She's an experienced parish priest, and she's a very interesting biblical scholar with a knowledge of mental health issues. So that's 2 weeks' time. This evening, Fraser is talking about a book which is already published, although very recently, and it's exciting, living deeply. It's exciting for those of you who've seen the book to hear Fraser speaking about it, and we get the chance to ask him questions and get his answers afterwards. So Fraser,
thank you very much. Yes. So it's a great pleasure to be here again. I enjoy my annual visits to Durham. One of the really nice things in my retirement from Cambridge University. So I will be largely talking about the book, but I want to say one or two things by introduction to it. I mean, as every social scientist in this area would say, there are a lot of people around who are spiritual but not religious. SBNR is the acronym. I think actually that acronym is a little bit hardline, and it makes it sound as though there is some sort of opposition between being religious and spiritual, which I don't think there need be. I meet a lot of people who I would say are more spiritual than religious, rather than spiritual but not religious. People who have their primary focus on spirituality vary in their attitudes to traditional religion. They're certainly not committed to it through thick and thin, but many of them, in my experience, are not resolutely opposed to it either. They sort of judge it on its merits, and if they find religion going on in a particular place that is that prioritizes spirituality, then they're mostly, or many of them, okay with that. That's my experience. So I think the SBNR is a slightly too hardline acronym, but that's the one that's got into the literature. There's also, I think, a distinctive spirituality of our time, which is focused on what in this book I call the inner journey, or the journey inwards. I think there are various other phrases for this. Quite a lot of what I know about this comes from a young Canadian colleague who Chris has met, Galen Watts, no relation of mine, who is studying spirituality in young Canadian millennials. In various settings, I'll come back to that. And he's been searching for some time for some appropriate term for the spirituality of our time. Self-spirituality, religion of the heart, are two terms. The spirit of late modernity. There does seem to be a kind of spirituality that you find in very diverse settings that is running very strongly in our time. He's been doing field work in 3 settings that vary a lot in how religious they are. He's been doing it in the C3 Church in Toronto, Charismatic Evangelical Church. At the secular end of the spectrum, in Toastmasters, an international sort of public speaking outfit, and in between, in 12 Steps, Alcoholics Anonymous, which is probably spiritual, but explicitly spiritual, but not religious. I think that the intriguing thing that is coming out of this field work is that there seems to be a common spirituality that you find in all three of these settings, which differ a lot in how religious they are. A spirituality that usually includes some spiritual practices, like yoga or mindfulness, which has a moral framework, is fundamentally focused on self-improvement, has an idea of something transcendent, a little bit unclear about exactly what might be transcendent, but certainly not taking us kind of, there is nothing more than what we can see around us kind of view. Self-improvement, I think, is a sort of core aspect of this, that you can become a better person through spiritual practices and moral commitments and connecting with some energies or something transcendent that is above and beyond you. This seems to be the spirituality that is running very strongly in our time. And I think it's fascinating that the C3 church, the Charismatic evangelical church that he's been studying, has essentially bought into this spirituality. And my hypothesis about why charismatic evangelical religion is flourishing at the moment is that it has bought into the sort of pan-spirituality of our time in a way that most churches have not. And I think that any church that buys into this strongly running tide of self-spirituality, whatever you want to call it, is going to flourish. And churches that keep it at arm's length are not going to, or not for much longer anyway. It seems to be carrying everything before it. And this has very important implications for how to run traditional churches. I mean, of course you can take an informed, in principle, decision that this is not the spirituality you want to endorse and to do something explicitly different. But I think in our time, the prospects of that succeeding are very, very slim. I don't think myself there's any need to take that stance because I don't see anything inherently unchristian in this kind of self-spirituality. I think it can be baptized into a Christian framework and ethos. I don't think there's anything fundamentally different about doing that from what any missionary does, which is to get to know the indigenous culture and to build some Christianity which incorporates that. That's what Christians have always done. Leslie Newbegin in particular has been a strong advocate of doing that, not just in far-off exotic cultures, but doing that in our own culture. And so my sort of bold hypothesis is that if Christian churches are going to flourish in our time, then they need to pay attention to this self-spirituality, the spirituality of the inner journey, and incorporate that into whatever they do. How should we talk about this inner journey? We have two languages for talking about this. A psychological language and a spiritual or religious, sometimes religious language. I think there's a strong case for using both of those languages, and that's the first thing I want to say. Partly for sort of demographic reasons, that neither of these languages works for everyone. And there may have been a time, though I'm not a good enough historian to be sure of this, there may have been a time when the religious language was a universal language and one that connected with everyone, everyone understood. But if that ever was the case, it's no longer the case. So talking in a religious or explicitly spiritual language is mystifying to an increasing number of people. So that, I think, is one initial very good reason for not relying on that as your sole language. More people now talk psychology than talk religion or spirituality. it is more of a common currency in our time, and I think that's another good reason for talking about this inner journey or self-spirituality in psychological terms as well as spiritual or religious terms. So this is an advocacy of what my friend John Polkinghorne, talking about science and religion, calls binocular vision, that science and religion illuminate different things. We understand the nature of reality better if we look at them through both perspectives together, through science and religion. I'm saying something very parallel to that here, that we understand the inner journey better if we look at it from the perspectives of both psychology and spirituality, rather than trying to rely on just one of those. And I don't think there's any incompatibility between these languages. They have different emphases, but I don't think there's any incompatibility between them. Psychology is, of course, quite varied, and there are some branches of psychology which are very explicitly open to a spiritual perspective. Transpersonal psychology is probably the umbrella term for the kind of psychology that is spiritually sympathetic. As everyone knows, the psychology of C.G. Jung is similarly spiritually sympathetic. In fact, it sometimes seems as though Jung's so-called psychology might have been a translation into apparently psychological terms of religious wisdom. His concept of the self, for example, a kind of higher and complete self, which is the image of God in the psyche. But perhaps the most important contribution of psychology to understanding the inner journey is to emphasize that it doesn't involve conforming to a single template. There's a stronger tradition in psychology of recognizing diversity than there is in religion and spirituality. People are very different. Psychologists are endlessly fascinated by the differences between people. Both the social sciences and religion, in their different ways and for different reasons, are more inclined to want to generalize about people. But psychology doesn't. Psychology is fascinated by how people differ. And I'm tempted to just digress on that for a moment, then I'll come back to my main track. My long-standing colleague and former student Leon Turner has done a very interesting book on the plural self, looking at the way psychology and theology have handled the complex issues about people having a sense of being a unitary person, but also a sense of having diversity, plurality, being different people in different contexts. And oversimplifying Leon's book grossly, the general trend in theology is to see the unitary person as where you start from. For many people, a kind of God-given starting point. Though things can get messed up, your personality can fragment under stress or through sin or something else like that. But the unitary person is the kind of starting point and the gold standard. I think psychology tends to look at it the other way around, that people are very fragmented. They interact in many different contexts. They need to function in different ways in different contexts. Work and home are different. Politicians find that there is a need to be all things to all people, to speak different languages in different contexts. Bishops find this going round the diversity of churches you encounter in the Church of England diocese. And if you're in that kind of position, and there are some jobs that bring it out more than others, then you are many different people in different places. And then there's another challenge of how to find some kind of unity or integration beyond all that diversity. And psychology is very interested in that. So I think for psychology, integration is a sort of goal to work towards, something to be aimed at. Whereas I think for theology, it tends to be, as I say, the natural starting point from which you can fall under stress or through sin. So, I mean, to go back to my track after that digression, I think it's one of the advantages of talking the psychological language about the inner journey, that it can more easily recognize that the inner journey takes different forms with different people. And I think that's a real advantage in our time. I want to develop a different argument for both of these languages around the metaphors of height and depth. Psychology generally wants to go deep. There is depth psychology, which is a kind of umbrella term for the psychodynamic psychologies of people like Freud and Jung and others. Psychology wants to get to the bottom of things. The language of religion is generally about going up. There is a traditional way of thinking about God as being in heaven, and many languages link heaven and sky in the same word. At the heart of the Eucharist, the priest says, lift up your hearts. Religion seems to want to soar, whereas psychology wants to go deep. There's a brilliant paper on all this from, I think, one of the most interesting Jungian psychologists, a guy called James Hillman, a paper called Peaks and Veils, in which he talks about this. He's rather suspicious of the religious tendency to want to soar. And I mean, he's very much a psychologist. He wants people to go deep, and even if they do soar at some point, wants to make sure that they go deep before they soar, and very wary of people trying to sort of soar in something like a manic defense before they have learned to go deep. My pitch on all this is that there is a place for both heights and depths. I agree with James Hillman about the value of going deep and getting some secure foundations, and attempts to build a spirituality that are not based on deep self-knowledge is likely to be ephemeral and insecure. But there's a problem the other way around, and I think psychology, after all its going deep, doesn't quite know what to do next. And it's one of the problems, I think, in psychotherapy. Even if the psychotherapy has been very good at delivering personal insight, what do you do with that? There's something useful about personal insight in itself. I think it enables you to tread in a more circumspect and wise way through the vicissitudes of life. I've been having another go at personal psychotherapy since my retirement just over 5 years ago. I've now had about 5 years of twice a week psychotherapy, which is a serious go at psychotherapy. I think, and I think I'm coming towards the end and reflecting on what I've got out of it, and certainly personal insight is one of the things. And I think there's an idea in some Freudian psychology that once you get inside, everything is going to be solved. I don't think that is the case. I haven't found that. But I do think I can probably navigate my way through potential pitfalls more wisely for the insight that I've acquired over the last 5 years in psychotherapy. But there is still often this problem in psychotherapy of where to go with insight and how to crystallize things in a way that brings about actual change. And I think spirituality is often better at doing that. In the days when I was doing pastoral work, I can think of quite a number of people with whom I had a lot of exploratory conversation about the nature of their problems. But then, after a certain period of doing that, it seemed helpful to pray with them, and that changes the nature of the relationship and the task. And when the ground is properly prepared for that, to change from just sort of talking around things to praying can sort of focus a kind of energy and move things on in a way that psychology often seems unable to do. So I think there are advantages in heights and depths. They both have their place, and I share the wariness of relying on just one or the other. And that's another reason for talking about the inner journey in the language that's both psychology and spirituality, because psychology naturally tends to talk about going deep and understanding things, and the spiritual language that comes from the religious table, it more naturally talks about movement, about going up or outwards, moving on from where you are. I want to make another pitch for these two languages in terms of head and heart. And for those who want to follow up on this, I edited a book called Head and Heart in 2013. The human mind seems to be structured in a way that has two ways of thinking, two ways of doing cognition. And I think this is distinctively human. I have come to this through different routes. One of them is in terms of what sort of hard-nosed psychologists call cognitive architecture, or people in AI. How the mind is organized, what sort of boxes there are in the mind. I particularly work with a cognitive architecture called interacting cognitive subsystems, developed by a former colleague of mine, Philip Barnard. I think it's an attractive architecture for various reasons. It's kind of comprehensive in a way that not many architectures are. It's pretty detailed, pretty precise. It's borne quite a wide range of interactions, from depression to human-computer interaction, to insomnia, to modern dance. So, I mean, and I think any theoretical framework that can be applied to such different things has got something going for it. And there's been enough work on ICS that we know where we are with it. Barnard has an interesting evolutionary account of how we've got to the architecture humans have, how mammals got from an initial 4-system architecture to an 8-system architecture in our primate ancestors. Humans, on this model, have a 9-system cognitive architecture. And the difference is that we have 2 central subsystems. All other mammals seem to have, on this model, just 1 central processor, an all-purpose central processor. But our linguistic abilities, our capacity for propositional thought, have given us an alternative central subsystem that Barnard calls the propositional subsystem, which is kind of split off from the what was the only central processor that he calls the implicational subsystem. Though I don't think that's a very intuitively obvious name for it, and people have played around with alternative names: intuitive subsystem, relational subsystem. It's a system that has better connections with the whole body than our propositional intelligence, better connection with emotion, more common sense. It's kind of tacit. It doesn't easily articulate what it knows, and for implicational insights to be articulated, things seems have to go through the propositional subsystem. They have to be translated into a different code to get there, and that changes things. And I think this is where the mystical insight about ineffability comes from. That you, after a mystical experience, you sense that you understand a lot of things very well that you didn't understand before, but you can't put those things into words. And I think that's because these sort of mystical insights arise in the implicational subsystem, and those insights have to be transferred into the propositional subsystem before you can articulate them. Of course, mystics do that, and mystics often write very long books about their mystical experience. It's not that you can't do it, but they clearly have a sense that you lose something in the process, and what you end up articulating is not quite the original thing, because you've had to kind of translate it in order to articulate it. You can come at head and heart, I think, through a different route, and some of you will know Ian McGilchrist's magisterial book, The Master and His Emissary, which is largely about brain lateralization, about the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. There are lots of caveats about this. One is that many of us have our language abilities in the left hemisphere, but only about 70% of us, and there are some who have it the other way around, or some who have it sort of split between the two hemispheres. So in talking the way McGilchrist does, and he's perfectly aware of this, he's really only talking about the 70%, and you need to tell a different story about the other 30%. Culturally, he thinks humans have become increasingly reliant on this linguistic left hemisphere that does abstract intelligence, propositional thinking. We use that to navigate through many situations. And in part 2 of this long book, he does a sort of cultural history, mainly through the last few centuries, sort of charting the course of ever greater reliance on our left hemisphere, though with some kickbacks. And the most interesting and important kickback is the Romantic movement. There seems to be a real attempt to get back to using the right brain. So I'm taking head and heart as a synonym for this, really, that we can know things with our heart, but in a rather intuitive, inarticulate way, we can know things with our head that we can articulate. One of the interesting things that McGilchrist brings out is the different kind of mood of these two hemispheres. That the right hemisphere has a mood of openness. It is inclined to reach out to the other. It is more humble, more receptive. The left hemisphere is inclined to want to nail things down. And to believe it has got things nailed down, and there is nothing worth knowing beyond what it has got nailed down. There's a kind of arrogance about the left brain with its propositional intelligence. And the emotional mood is different as well. The more intuitive right brain is more melancholy, whereas the left brain is inclined to be chirpy at the cost of being superficial, lacking in depth. So we come back here in a way into something like the sort of heights and depths that I was talking about before. The point I'd want to make here is parallel to the one I made about heights and depths, that it's helpful in the inner journey to be using both our head and our heart, not just one of the two. It's 5 o'clock already. I've been rabbiting on more than I realised. I better be a little bit more disciplined. So, I've been saying how fragmented humans are. That is my own experience. It's been another insight that for me has come out of psychotherapy, which is that almost every question that comes up, I have 2 alternative responses to it. My head says one thing and my heart, my intuition says another. So in psychotherapy, I think I've become more aware of these sort of alternative modes of understanding things than I was before. And I think this is one of the problems for human beings. It leads us to be very fragmented people. And there's a problem of how to hold all this together. And I think that's one of the things that people are seeking in self-spirituality, the religion of the heart. They're wanting to hold things together. The big virtue of our time is authenticity. That's the virtue that has become the kind of supreme virtue in our time. If you're authentic, if you're sincere, if you have integrity, then almost whatever else you do, it's all right. It is the sort of trump card in the moral pack of the 21st century. It's the virtue that people are obsessed with. But how do you become authentic if you're fragmented in the way that I've been describing? It is really quite a problem. And it's very important, I think, whether the inner journey helps you to integrate or whether it fragments things. And there are different ways of doing the inner journey that can go in both of those directions. There's a way of doing the inner journey that is rejecting of things about yourself you disapprove of, that other people disapprove of wanting to sort of chuck some things overboard and be left with just what you think are the good parts of yourself. There's another way of thinking about the inner journey that puts the emphasis on integration, wants to hold things together. Jung is a very strong advocate of this. Jung's word for the sort of dark side of our personality we might want to get rid of is the shadow. And Jung is very insistent about the importance of integrating the shadow, not trying to get rid of it. And as he says somewhere, if you try to get rid of the shadow, it will come back like a thief in the night, seeking its revenge. So the attempt to sort of lock part of your personality off, I think, doesn't work. And it doesn't provide the kind of authenticity and integrity that people in our time have an overwhelming desire to seek. But there is another version, I think, of the religious life that does provide that integration, where things get aligned together, where your thoughts and feelings and actions are all aligned together. In the book, I use the analogy of how a magnet can bring some kind of neat alignment to a chaotic pile of iron filings. Things start to work together. And I think that's one of the reasons why spiritual practices can be helpful. Most of the time we're doing a lot of multitasking, and it's one of the advantages of having this complex cognitive architecture we have, that it enables us to do multitasking, to be processing different things with different parts of our cognitive capacities at the same time. Most spiritual practices blow the whistle on that, and there is a serious effort to just do one thing at a time, to be entirely focused on whatever it is you are choosing to be your focus. You may focus on your breath, you may focus on the Jesus prayer, you may focus on the flickering flame of a candle. Whatever it is, you try to be totally focused on that one thing rather than multitasking. And I think that's one of the psychological reasons why spiritual practices are good training for the more integrated way of living and being that people need if they're going to find the integrity and authenticity they need. There's a lot of ancient wisdom about this, and I mean, it's one of the fascinating things that you find a lot of sort of personal pastoral wisdom in ancient writers, and Chris has done some very good work on Evagrius. I've done some much more sketchy work on a 17th century Benedictine called Augustine Baker, who was a spiritual director to a lot of nuns. I think he was a very busy spiritual director and was directing a lot of nuns in their spiritual life, and was obviously a very keen observer of the psychological processes that these nuns were describing to him in their efforts to pray, and developed a lot of very sound practical wisdom about this that has a lot of commonalities with modern cognitive behaviour therapy. I mean, the language is old-fashioned, but the content is actually very consistent with what you might arrive at from cognitive behaviour therapy. For Augustine Baker, there are two main impediments to the spiritual life, to prayer. To quote, "There are two general impediments that nature lies in our way to hinder us from attending to God. The first is distracting images, the second, unquiet passions." So, the task for Augustine Baker, if you're going to get anywhere in the spiritual life, is to find a way of dealing with your distracting images and unquiet passions. That resonates with me. I have a lot of both distracting images and unquiet passions. You probably do as well. So he's very, very keen that people shouldn't get too cross about these distracting images or disapproving of them. And his word for what we should do with them, I think it's a beautiful word, is to neglect them. It's a word that conveys a marvellous lack of conflict about them. Just neglect them. In case they be simply vain thoughts that then wander unsettled in his mind, let him not willingly pursue them, but rather neglect them. Whereas, if they be sinful imaginations, let him, as well as he can, divert quietly his mind from them, and now and then, without much force, lift up his mind unto God, or use some familiar prayers, or say the beads without much forced attention. And he's very critical of spiritual directors who encourage conflict, as like this, as example, in the case of injury received, they advise that we should call to mind all the circumstances that are apt to kindle indignation and resentment, and as soon as the passion is inflamed, then to suppress it by consideration of the example of our Lord and his precept of charity to enemies, of the dangerous effects of revenge and the blessed rewards of patience. Not a good way to go, as far as Augustine is concerned. Just neglect your intrusive thoughts or divert quietly your mind from them. And that seems to be a way of doing the spiritual life that leads people towards integration rather than fragmentation. To turn and say something more specific about the book, it goes through 3 sections. One dealing with personal issues, the next with relational issues, and the last with spiritual and religious issues. And in writing about personal issues, I start from psychology deliberately. I think psychology, as I've said, is in our time the more accessible, the more widely understood language for starting to think about these things. But in each chapter I begin to introduce some kind of more explicitly spiritual perspective. So there's a chapter about coping with stress, in which I say a lot of the standard and obvious things from psychology about coping with stress, but then introduce prayer as a way of coping with stress. And I very much like the work that Chris has done about this in sort of seeing prayer and worry as kind of alternatives. If there's something difficult happening to you, it's easy to worry about it. Something else you can do with it is to pray about it. And these often do function as alternatives. And I think the teaching of Jesus seems to suggest quite explicitly that prayer is a good alternative to worry. It's an idea that's very congenial to the kind of prevailing self-improvement spirituality in our time. How to cope with stress is one of the things that people are concerned about and find challenging and difficult. And psychology is an accessible language that they already use for that. But if they find things in the spiritual traditions that gives them extra useful ways of coping with stress and worry, then people are very receptive to them, whether they find those in a religious tradition or not. I mean, this is in tune with the ethos of our time. In the next chapter I go on to talk about depression, and after saying many of the sort of standard, largely cognitive-behavioural things about depression, I introduce some spiritual perspective on depression, which I think often sees depression as not all bad. You have to be careful in how you phrase this, as I'm well aware that how unpleasant and crippling serious depression can be. But I think there's something in the spiritual traditions which is inclined to say that anything can be a blessing to you. I've been very struck for a long time by that passage in St. Paul where he talks about the virtue of giving thanks for everything. And presumably, if you take that seriously, that includes giving thanks for depression, which is a bit strong, and I'm not sure I want to go all the way with that, but I do think there are helpful things about depression. If you've been leading a life in which sort of fundamental needs have not been met, and if you've been trying to deny who you are in some way, that is likely to lead you to being depressed and not continuing your life in that kind of way I think it can be a very helpful thing to do. Of 20th century British Christians, one splendid example of that was Harry Williams, who was Dean of Trinity College, had come out of a fairly Anglo-Catholic stable, was sort of quite a proper Anglo-Catholic priest. He was gay, but had been unwilling to acknowledge this or do anything about it. He had a rather spectacular and public nervous breakdown and was off from Trinity College for quite a long time, and did some serious psychotherapy, and in the course of which he did come to recognise his sexual orientation and decide that he was not going to go on pretending that was other than what it was, and also found some splendid personal authenticity in the course of that, and so became a kind of priest and preacher who was very much in tune with the spirituality of our time, which has, as I've said, authenticity as its core virtue. And in the book of sermons that he preached after he returned from his nervous breakdown, he says rather movingly that he decided never again to preach anything that he did not know to be true from personal experience, which is quite a self-denying ordinance, I think, and probably not one many preachers can live up to. So, I mean, I hope it's obvious how that connects. Harry Williams went through quite a serious depression, but it was valuable for him in leading to a realignment of his life and to spiritual growth. After some more years at Trinity College, he went to be a priest in the Community of the Resurrection at Mirfield. Similarly, there's a chapter about loss. Loss is very difficult for all of us, and we all struggle with it, and it's particularly difficult if you have multiple losses at the same time. But there's still a fascinating phenomenon of post-traumatic growth, that after you've been through some traumatic experience, you're not necessarily just crushed by it. There is also quite a track record of people finding some growth after that, and it's usually growth in the spiritual direction. And Joanna Collicutt, who's on the staff of Ripon College in Oxford, has done she's a clinical psychologist and has done some interesting research, particularly amongst brain damage patients, about examples of post-traumatic growth, but also use that paradigm to do some psychological interpretation of religious things, and particularly how the early Christian community recovered from the trauma of the crucifixion of Jesus. So I have a series of chapters there which I sort of start talking the psychological language and begin to bring in a spiritual language. And in presenting things this afternoon, I'm going to jump around a bit in a way that's slightly different from how it's laid out in the book. And in the later section, I come back to some moral issues, particularly in the chapter called Darkness and Light. And I think the most important thing I'm trying to say there is that good and bad, good and evil are intertwined and very close together. And so implicit in what I've been saying so far is how adverse experiences like stress, depression, loss can turn out all right. They can turn out well. And that seems to me the core of the Christian gospel, as I understand it. Not that Christians won't have adverse experiences, but they're being pointed towards ways in which they can turn out well if they have them. That's not to say they should seek them, but there are directions and pointers and resources that can help things to turn out well. And this leads, I think, to reflect on how closely intertwined good and bad are. I've done a lot of work on emotions over the years, and I've been intrigued at how difficult it is to say whether a particular emotion is good or bad. Most emotions are negative in a way. The positive emotions are sort of few and far between and don't seem to have much flesh on them. A lot of negative emotions, but they're not all bad. I suppose anger is the one that a lot of people struggle with, really, that anger can be very destructive, but there can also be a good anger that motivates people in helpful directions. And it's fascinated me for a long time how explicitly St. Mark's Gospel talks about Jesus being angry. There's clearly nothing wrong for a Christian with anger in itself. And guilt as well. I think there is a guilt that is realistic and appropriate and helpful, and another kind of guilt that is neurotic and excessive, sort of runs all over the place. There are the germs of that distinction in Freud. And I've also been fascinated by the stories of the temptations of Jesus in the Gospels, and we're just coming up to Lent when churchgoers are likely to hear those stories. And it strikes me that there's a bit of a knife edge of a difference between the things that Jesus is tempted to do but decides not to do, and what he eventually actually does. I mean, he's tempted to turn stones into bread, but he actually feeds the starving multitudes in the desert. I mean, he's tempted to sort of throw himself off the pinnacle of the temple, but eventually he allows himself to be crucified and rises from it. I mean, these are not massive differences, they're quite subtle differences, I think, between the temptations he rejects and what he actually does. And I think it's more to do with sort of how you do things and where you're coming from than anything else. And again, I think that sort of makes the point that good and evil are very closely intertwined. And there's a really important message in the Christian tradition, I think, about deconstructing our categories of what is a good and bad thing in our lives. I mean, the prevailing way of thinking about that is basically hedonistic. Good things are what we like, bad things are what we don't like. Pleasurable or not. But there's a radically different way of thinking about things, and I think this is one of the really helpful spiritual resources in the religious traditions, that there's a more important distinction that cuts across that one, kind of orthogonal to it. St. Ignatius talks about the distinction between consolation and desolation, things that bring you closer to God or things that lead you further away from God. There's the dark night of the soul, in which you experience an absence of God but can grow through it, so it's not all bad. And theologically, I think this leads to the fundamental question, and I touch on this in the book, about, well, there's a subsection heading that just asks, is God good, in inverted commas? Linguistically, across different languages, there are two basic roots for words about God. Some are aligned with the concept of good, and God and good are obviously aligned. There's another set of words where the alignment is with all. Allah is aligned with all, not with good. These two linguistically quite different ways of thinking about God. And it's sort of the age-old problem of theodicy, really, how to reconcile God being all and God being good. These two quite different ways of thinking about God. And I mean, if I'd solved the problems of theodicy, I would be more famous than I am. but I think it takes you some way to doing that, to deconstruct the concept of good a little bit. So if good is less like what you enjoy and a little bit more like Ignatius' consolations, something that draws you closer to God, or to phrase it in modern ways, things that help you to become your true self, the person you have it in your potential to be, the self, as Jung calls it. In that sense, then, yes, I think God is good, and some of our problems about the goodness of God, I think, come from too narrow and limited a way of thinking about God.
Did you say A-W-E or?
So,
Or as A-W-E?
and A-double-L.
A-double-all, not all.
All,
Yeah, okay.
yes, all, sorry. There's a section of the book on relationships. I'm going to skip over that because I've been talking too much. And I want to come to the last section, which is moving towards thinking about God. And that section begins with the chapter on something more. And I think if you're trying to take people on a spiritual journey from where they are to where they might be, then a good place to start is with the sense that there is something more. When there are surveys of spiritual experiences, there are a lot of people who've had an experience that there is something more, or that the spiritual side of life is important. And I think there's quite a bit of scientific support for something like this as well, that our apparently material world is not as simply material as it looks, and it's not scientifically credible to say that there is nothing else than the material world, that everything that there is must come from the material world because there's nowhere else it could come from. Cosmology recognizes that our space-time universe came out of something that existed before, in some sense, and if you can use that word before, but space and time are not, for cosmologists, eternal. That's the sort of bottom line of Stephen Hawking's brief history of time. We're not quite sure what they might have come out of. A fluctuation in the quantum vacuum is the current best guess, I think. But the important thing, I think, from a spiritual point of view, is the recognition in cosmology, as well as in theology, that there is something more, something beyond the space-time universe in which we live. There are different ideas about what that is, but I think agreement that there is something more. And agreement also that matter is not what it looks. And Einstein has his famous equation that translates energy into matter. In Peter Atkins, in his atheistic book on creation, has the rather nice phrase, I think, that the university is elegantly reorganized nothing. Or at least elegantly reorganized energy. And there are some physicists who speculate that energy isn't the final word, and there may be information behind the energy. So I think science is very strongly supporting the widespread human intuition that there is something more. And if we're trying to take people on a spiritual journey, that is a good place to start. And then God. My sense is that God has become a very problematic word for a lot of people in our society. And I think that's because of the connotations it has. And there seems to have been a historical shift towards an increasingly anthropomorphic way of thinking about God. And the problem, I think, is with the anthropomorphism, not with the reality of God. That God is thought of as very much like some superhuman being, but bigger and better. And someone who is your sort of constant companion in the way that another human can be your constant companion. There are some people for whom that makes good sense, but many other people in our society for whom that way of thinking about God, I think, doesn't make sense. So it seems to me if we're going to find a Christianity that connects with the spiritual but not religious generation, then we need to be, people in the churches need to be less insistent that that's the only way of thinking and talking about God. And there are alternatives. There is a tradition of thinking about God as some kind of energy, and New Agey Christians, many think about God in that kind of way. And there's also, thirdly, an apophatic tradition which recognizes that God is so mysterious and so far beyond us that any way of thinking about God is seriously inadequate, and we should stop believing and trusting in any linguistic formulations we have about God. And incidentally, that's points to a way of being religious that's more right hemisphere than left hemisphere. So in this book, I try and sort of take people, as it says, on the psychological and spiritual journey. It starts with the psychological journey, but it ends up more with the spiritual journey. And I think in our time, in a culture that is largely spiritual but not religious, that's the way of understanding the inner life that makes sense to people and is accessible. Thank you.